April 15th, 1969. 4 American Air Force Phantom jets roll out onto a runway in South Korea. Each one is armed with a 330 kiloton nuclear bomb, roughly 20 times the force of the one dropped on Hiroshima. The pilots are given pre-designated targets and told to await orders. They should be ready to strike at a moment's notice. And the reason for all of this? The American president Richard Nixon is fucking shit-faced. See, earlier that day, to celebrate Kim Il-sung's birthday, North Korea had shot down an American airplane, and after a couple of drinks, Nixon had gotten furious and ordered a nuclear strike in retaliation. Luckily though, Nixon's national security chiefs were not drunk and decided to wait with issuing the final orders until the next day, at which point, thankfully, Nixon had sobered up and thought better of it. However, this is also far from the only crazy thing Nixon ever did under the influence. For instance, in September of 1970, Nixon was drunk on a vacation in the Bahamas when suddenly he received a phone call. Palestinian militants had hijacked 4 airplanes and landed them in Syria. Bomb Damascus were his orders. Now, not wanting to lose their jobs, but also realizing this was a terrible idea, his chiefs once again slow-rolled his orders, making sure the necessary assets weren't in position until the next morning, by which time Nixon had once again sobered up. Now, if you think it's a bit stupid to have such an erratic alcoholic in charge of America's doomsday arsenal, thankfully, you're not alone. By 1974, with the Watergate scandal tearing Nixon's presidency apart, his drinking began spiraling so far out of control that his own Secretary of Defense, James Schlesinger, instructed his generals to ignore any sudden strike orders issued by Nixon, particularly emphasizing ones involving nukes. Everything had to first get his or Secretary of State Kissinger's approval first. That is quite a crazy story, and one of just many that we'll cover in this video. From that one time Russia could have become a Muslim country to a massive invasion of Europe being averted entirely because of one leader's drinking habits. However, beneath these wild stories are also some deeper questions that I want to tackle. See, historically, heavy drinking has been way more prominent among world leaders than most people realize. And it has to do with the bizarre role that alcohol plays in human power structures, which is so universal that it even extends into many Muslim countries as well. See, while the Prophet Muhammad banned alcohol and certainly did not drink himself, just 50 years after his death, starting with Yazid I, Islamic leaders once again began drinking and partying like goddamn frat boys, and although there were exceptions, continued to do so for the next 1,000 or so years. Heck, even in modern times, there are examples like Pakistan, which is linked to several Islamic terrorist groups, sheltered Osama bin Laden, and has even outlawed alcohol for its own citizens. However, none of that prevented several Pakistani leaders from drinking themselves. Heck, some of them have even been fairly heavy drinkers. Yahya Khan, for instance, reportedly drank from dawn till dusk, and according to some sources, is even said to have been shit-faced while signing away numerous orders during his Bangladeshi genocide. And so, what gives? What makes alcohol so damn prominent amongst our leaders? Well, there are 2 main factors at play. Firstly, politicians have to engage with an ungodly amount of socializing, and in almost every single country, that includes copious amounts of alcohol. Secondly, holding a high-level government position, and especially being the leader, comes with immense pressure, and as a result, even a minor alcohol habit can very easily spiral out of control. And it is the combination of these 2 factors that over the years has broken so many world leaders. However, out of everyone, there is one particular example that better embodies this dynamic than anyone else. But to understand that, we have to quickly go back in time for a moment. September 28th, 1994, Washington, D.C. two Secret Service agents are driving around Pennsylvania Avenue in the middle of the night when suddenly they stumble upon something weird. An old man wearing nothing but his underwear. Wait, hold up a second. That's the Russian president, Boris Yeltsin, the man in charge of the largest nuclear arsenal on the planet, drunk all alone in the middle of the night looking for a pizza. And yeah, that actually happened. And moreover, it didn't stop there. The next day, somehow he snuck out yet again. When he then returned later that evening, a minor incident occurred where the guards assigned to his diplomatic villa thought that there was just some random old man trying to break into the basement. So they took him down only to discover that, oh, once again, that's President Yeltsin. For Christ's sake. When it comes to drunk leaders, Boris Yeltsin is likely the first person who comes to mind. However, what few people know is that when he was younger, Yeltsin utterly detested alcohol, refusing to drink and would even snatch vodka bottles from his friends to prevent them from doing so. Now, he did eventually loosen up and try alcohol on his own. However, what really changed things was when he joined the Communist Party. Here, the networking and constant banquets inevitably drove his intake up. And furthermore, in '85, he was promoted to a powerful position in Moscow, and while he had previously been able to keep his drinking somewhat together, under the new heavy workload, things began to spiral. Yeltsin himself writing his autobiography, alcohol was the only means to quickly get rid of stress. Moreover, things got even worse when a serious medical emergency left him with debilitating chronic pains. However, he persevered and powered on with his career, and by 1991, as the Soviet Union collapsed, he found himself thrust into the presidency of the brand new Russian Federation. With the weight of the world now resting on his shoulders, everything got 10 times worse, and he essentially became trapped with alcoholism, which was of course a tragedy, not just for Yeltsin, but for the entirety of Russia. See, as the messy transition to capitalism got underway, extreme levels of chaos, crime and corruption swept across the country, and the man in charge of dealing with it all was utterly incapable. Jesus, what the f are you doing? Dude, this is lame. Anyone can make a video about drunk leaders bad. Do something original. Now, as much as I don't want to give in to violence, I have to admit that he has a point. This video is getting a bit predictable, and so something cool we could do is flip everything on its head and ask the question, could drunken leaders somehow be a good thing? Well, one angle we could take there is that if our leaders drink a lot, they'll gain a very heavy tolerance, and historically speaking, that has been a very valuable asset in the field of diplomacy. For instance, the Iron Chancellor of Germany, Otto von Bismarck, once remarked about his own massive tolerance for alcohol that, and I quote, "such tricks were formerly an indispensable part of the diplomat's trade. They drank the weaker vessels onto the table, wormed all they wanted to know out of them, made them agree to things which were contrary to their instructions, of which at least they had no authority. Then they were compelled to put down their signatures at once, and afterwards, when they got sober, they could not imagine what they had done." Now, but when it comes to alcohol being exploited for diplomacy, as you might expect, no one beats the Russians. One such example being Peter the Great, founder of the Russian Empire, measuring a colossal 6'8" at a time when the average height was 5'5". He was an enormous person that could outdrink basically any man alive. For instance, in 1710, the 19-year-old Duke of neighboring Courland attempted to match Peter's drinking at a wedding and died. And so naturally, Peter did what any gracious host would do in such a situation, by ordering his troops into the dead Duke's lands and seizing them for himself. Yoink! Now, not only did Peter enjoy drinking, but he would also force his guests, and especially foreign dignitaries, to at least try and keep up with him. Anyone who didn't drink enough was considered rude and would be punished with the Great Eagle. The Great Eagle being a massive ornated chalice that was filled with 1.5 liters of pure vodka or strong wine to be chugged immediately. Jesus Christ! And moreover, sometimes this wasn't even a punishment either, but just a welcome drink of sorts. With, for instance, one Prussian diplomat complaining in his diaries about being forced to drink an entire Great Eagle as soon as he arrived in St. Petersburg. What a lovely host. Now, you might be wondering, why? What the hell was the point in all this? Well, you see, once he'd gotten his guests sufficiently drunk, Peter would start barraging them with questions, trying to dig out any kind of sensitive information they may be carrying. A type of behavior, moreover, which the Russians have long been notorious for, and not just in the 1700s. For instance, during the Cold War, the Chinese premier Zhou Enlai had earned himself the nickname of Qianbei Bozui, meaning still sober after 1,000 glasses. His tolerance was mythical, his liver the stuff of legends. But when he went to Russia and tried to outdrink the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, he was so outmatched that he wound up puking on the floor. This being such an embarrassment for him that he issued a public apology to the Chinese people for embarrassing them on the international stage. Now, naturally, such a thing would never repeat itself. However, for the rest of his career, Zhou would repeatedly complain of the Soviets constantly trying to weaken him with alcohol during negotiations. However, it wasn't just with the Chinese that the Soviets used this tactic. In 1972, while in Moscow to put the finishing touches on the anti-ballistic missile treaty, US President Richard Nixon reportedly had a bit too much to drink, at which point the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev went on the attack, aggressively pressuring him to make even more concessions, although it ultimately didn't work. However, just 1 year later in 73, suddenly the tables had turned. During a visit in California, one evening Brezhnev had himself gotten absolutely hammered. He then stumbled into the hallway and began babbling off about all sorts of things that he should not be telling the Americans about. His translator reportedly tried to cover his ass by not translating everything, yet despite his efforts, one CIA agent later called the information gathered from this, quote, a minor coup.
Now, there are also more aggressive ways of going about this. For instance, at his father's funeral, the Viking king, Ingjerd the Ill-Ruler, made a solemn vow to expand his inherited empire by 1/2 in each direction. Then, later that night, when everyone had gotten blackout drunk, he snuck out the back and lit his great hall on fire, killing everyone inside. And among the dead were 6 neighboring chieftains, whose territories he then yoinked for himself, fulfilling his promise.
However, everything also doesn't have to be so hostile. In 1942, Winston Churchill traveled to Moscow to meet with Joseph Stalin. He brought bad news. Britain would not open up a second front against Germany that year, and so naturally, Stalin was pissed. As a result, the first few days of negotiations were very tense and highly unproductive. However, everything would change when one night Churchill went to Stalin's dacha. Here, the two men, both of them legendary consumers of alcohol, went on an all-night drinking bender, and when the sun finally rose, both men had handled it so well that they had each earned each other's respect. And going forward, the two men would be much more at ease with each other, resulting in a much more productive and smooth relationship. In other words, alcohol helps proud men with big egos get along, something that is indispensable for high-level diplomacy. As one ancient Chinese text put it, harmony between states is brought about through the drinking of wine. However, where this plays the biggest role might not actually be on the international stage, but at home on the domestic level, with one particularly cool example actually coming here from my home country, Denmark. Back during the Great Depression, with an unemployment rate sitting at 44%, the government was desperate to work out a budget but suffered from severe gridlock. Then, the different parties decided to meet in this apartment behind me for negotiations. And after 15 hours of tense negotiations, at 3 in the morning, there was a spat. And as the angry leaders of the largest right-wing party were putting on their coats to leave, suddenly the Prime Minister came and offered them a final glass of whiskey so they could at least end on a positive note. And so they sat down with a good bottle, and what do you know, almost like magic, 3 hours later they had hammered out one of the most important political compromises in Danish history. Now, on this topic of alcohol helping politicians get along and work together, I do find it notable that over the last couple of years, as Western democracies have become increasingly deadlocked and dysfunctional, the rate of political drinking has fallen off a cliff. As former US Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta put it, Democrats and Republicans don't work together anymore, and a big part of the reason is that they don't drink together anymore. Now, but let's also be real for a second. There are some other and much bigger reasons why Western democracies have become so chaotic and polarized. But I do still think you can make a case that this has at least played some small role in the equation. And in this regard, there is also something else that we need to bring up. See, the ancient Romans used to have this saying, in vino veritas. In wine, there is truth. If you've ever been drunk, you've likely found yourself saying things you wouldn't have said sober. In other words, you don't really have a filter. And some civilizations have actually found a way to utilize that productively. For instance, according to the Greek historian Herodotus, the ancient Persians would debate all important decisions twice, once sober and then drunk. The idea allegedly being that it's very difficult for a man under the influence to hide any sketchy ulterior motives. Heck, even the ancient Athenians of all people held a similar view of alcohol, with the frequent drinking parties known as symposia therefore becoming an almost informal cornerstone of their direct democracy. Heck, there's also more recent examples. For instance, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was the founding father of modern Turkey, and he loved to drink, reportedly consuming about half a liter of hard liquor every single day, and then got liver cirrhosis and died at 57. However, what's more important is what happened when he was alive. See, being a dictator with a downright mythical status, most people were quite nervous talking to him, often resolving to just showering him with praise. Now, Ataturk did not find this kind of ass-kissing very productive, and so he found a workaround with his good friend, alcohol. See, almost every evening he would invite a bunch of people to his own private dinner table. Here, they would be served generous amounts of alcohol, and in turn, he often found that they began to loosen up and speak more freely. At which point they began debating and bouncing around ideas all night long. Heck, it wasn't uncommon for these sessions to last all the way till 5 AM the next morning, covering so many topics and important matters of business along the way that some started half-jokingly comparing them to Plato's Academy. However, on the topic of private drinking parties shaping politics, no one beats the British. As of me making this in 2026, the British Parliament has not 1, not 2, but 9 fucking bars, annually subsidized by over £10 million of taxpayer money. Entire books have been written about the massive influence of political drinking clubs, and heck, for a long time it was completely normal for members of parliament to vote under the influence. And so it probably shouldn't come as a big surprise that, besides Churchill, Britain has had numerous other heavy drinking prime ministers. For instance, Jerrold Wilson would always chug 2 to 3 brandies before going out to his weekly prime minister's questioning time. Moreover, there's also H.H. Asquith. He drank so much that in the English dictionary there's literally a word for drunk named after him, squiffy. But probably the most consequential example has got to be William Pitt the Younger, who on his doctor's orders is said to have consumed 2 to 3 bottles of port wine every single day. until dying in office at 46 years of age. Moreover, his very sudden death created a power vacuum inside Britain that actually had a noticeable impact on the ongoing Napoleonic Wars. However, I won't actually go into too much detail on that, because on this topic of the drinking habits of world leaders impacting ongoing conflicts, there is one other example which is frankly 10 times more interesting. See, during the 13th century, Europe was collectively holding its breath as the Mongol Empire was barreling through Eastern Europe. By 1241, they had reached the outskirts of Vienna, and a final showdown for the destiny of Europe seemed inevitable. Until suddenly, one day, the Mongols were just gone. And as time went on, it became increasingly clear that they were gone for good, never to return this far west ever again. And so, what the hell happened? Well, it turns out that the great Khan of the Mongols, Ögedei, third son of Genghis Khan himself, was a bit of an alcoholic. He absolutely loved to drink, and after one particularly long bender, his liver gave out and he died. And so his armies had to return home for the ensuing power struggle. I mean, think about that for a second. My entire continent, Europe, was saved almost entirely because of alcohol. And to me, that is a very positive thing. Which does also remind me of that question I asked earlier. Could drunken leaders be a good thing? Well, after everything we've just covered, can we now confidently answer in the affirmative? No. Let me be real here. I chose to explore this question entirely because I thought it would make for an interesting video. It's a cool thought experiment. However, drunken leaders are obviously not a good idea, even if there are some niche benefits. Now, earlier in the video, I promised you guys a little story about Russia and a potential conversion to Islam. Well, I think it's about time. But also, I do first want to give a little special thanks to all my Patreons. Or my one Patreon. He is a really cool dude. From the bottom of my heart, seriously, thank you for the support. And to anyone else, if you enjoy my content and would like to see more of it in the future, and would also like to see some kick-ass behind-the-scenes vlogs where I go over my various practical effects and how I do them, you're more than welcome to check out my Patreon as well. Link in the description. But anyway, let's get back to it. In the 10th century, when Prince Vladimir of Kiev was selecting a new religion for himself and his people, he at one point received a Muslim delegation. And as soon as they mentioned that Muslims can't drink, he immediately rejected them, stating, "Drinking is the joy of all the Rus. We cannot live without that pleasure." Damn, that is probably the most Russian thing I've ever read about. However, on this topic of absurd things happening in Russian history, did you know that Vladimir Putin once broadcast a sex tape on national TV and that it played a massive role in his rise to power? No? Well, thankfully you can click right here and learn everything about that story. Adios!